Questions?
Well, thank you very much. I like almost all of your points, but it's a very good question, however it will be, So, and my first is about this competition and selection and so on. So somehow I believe that, what you provide us with the example of this bug-like dogs and so on. I mean, this bulldog and, and you say that this is not this is a domestication and so on, but the domestication is the Darwin's most, case of the artificial selection and so on. So maybe it's not about selection, but about some limits of selection. If this selection is something like a frequency dependent and so on, or embarrassing, it stabilizes it and so on. But if you put the limits and canalize this effect of the selection, you can, push the plasticity to its extreme, and then you will get, for example, the power of sexual selection, for example, in shaping the organisms and so on. I think that, I do not say that, this is a matter of discussion, of course, but it could not be smashed so quickly, because selection is whatever, so selection is also...
And I think, so very often, especially people trying to explain evolution to people who doubt it and favor ideas of creationism, for example, those people very often refer to domestication as being the equivalent of evolution by natural selection, just the evolution by unnatural selection. Now, I think that there is a major difference between these two processes, in the sense that in the domestication procedure, you keep the organisms alive no matter what. You have a particular property in mind, for example, increased milk yield in cattle. Now, you will do anything it takes to get to that point. So even if during the process of selecting for increased milk yield, you will generate incompatibilities between different other traits, you will still keep the organism alive. And if you do that, then presumably if there is genetic variation that allows you to do so, you can get increased milk yield.
Is it you will let the organism alive, or is it kind of, it could be very similar in this situation which we see in the nature, because you just maybe, okay, I dislike this, and I will select them, and what define the sense of your...
No, I don't think that this is the same process. Of course, there are similarities in this process, but I think it's an important distinction that natural selection acts on all characters in proportion to how much they contribute to fitness. Artificial selection does not do that. That's an important distinction.
I don't know that. So I cannot agree fully, because if I will make a very strong artificial selection, for example, to foxes like the life and so on, I will change the whole morphology. I will get also traits that are correlated with that, and some of them surprising like flex and so on.
Yes.
So it's not like that I will, immediately make a...
No. But these changes that you generate, they do not kill the organism because you are feeding it. But so as Haldane pointed out, Haldane wrote in this where he wrote that only 1 out of 1,024 would survive. He took the example of someone who tries to breed cattle, and you would like to have higher milk yield, but you might also want to have a longer lifetime, and you may want to have a greater meat production. You can have several characters. Now, if you have one character, then 50% of the population has a value above the average, and 50% of the population has a value below the average. Right? No, but wait 1 minute. Wait 1 minute. If you have another character, you add a second one, and assuming that they're not genetically correlated, only 25% of the population combines the desired properties in both characters. Because 50% had a higher value for the one trait, 50% has a higher value, but only like the 1/4 has a value for both. Now, you introduce a third character, right? If you continue to 10 characters, then only 1 out in 1024 of your population has the desired properties of these characters. So he said that this is impossible. For a cattle breeder, you cannot cull even half of your individuals because it ruins you. So that was the problem from the point of view of the cattle breeder. But when Moto Kimura wrote about this in 1994, he took the perspective of natural selection. And he said, now assume that there is a number of mutations. Many mutations would be selected against because of their like negative impact, their deleterious mutations. But let us assume that we have a number of beneficial mutations that occur. Now, natural selection will act on all of these in proportion to their effect on fitness, if we have to believe like normal theory. Then he showed that the selection coefficient on each of those then becomes so low for the same reason as Haldane explained, that there's only 1 out of 1024. So he said in a population that has like mammals, for example, where the reproductive capacity is not such that one individual produces 1,000 offspring to replace the rest of the population, this is never ever going to happen.
Okay, but now you are using the theory, to give support to what we are talking about, and I am talking about the principles, So, and you provide the criticism. I can agree with that, of course, but you provide it's nice. But you just said, that the artificial selection could not be the natural process because I will not kill the animal. It's not like that, actually. I will not, this animal reproduce, or I decrease its reproduction, fitness, and so on. So in this is the same, actually. And that means also, and my next, my other example was asexual selection.
Yeah.
But I think that this is for a local discussion, and thank you very much for that. It was just like a,
Now, like sexual selection, I haven't thought about sexual selection very much, but also there, like if you exert strong sexual selection on a particular trait, then it may have adverse effects on the rest of the organism, right? But assuming that happens on all the individuals in the population, then being sexually selected does not necessarily mean that you have a decrease in fitness. So there I'm a little bit doubting. I haven't thought about it much. I don't know to what extent sexual selection could lead to dramatic change where natural selection could not. But I'm a little bit out in the open there. So a little bit on the fence.
Thank you for nice talk. I agree with almost everything. However, I don't know what you mean by genetic evolution, because as far as I know, it's not true that we don't know a lot about genetics or speciation. There are some model systems like helicopters, butterflies, sticklebirds, and Darwin finches, and so on, where we know that mostly species differ in morphology, and that it's caused by 1 or 2 important loci, which has such large effect on phenotypic variation. So I still believe that it's the best model. I absolutely agree that there are hundreds of constraints like epistatic interaction and correlation between traits and so on. However, I think that the real progress is to have a good idea, and the good idea is rare, because it must be connected to additive genetic change, and then it must spread, it must overcome all these epistatic interaction and so on. And we all know that really clever, good ideas are rare, and still the persons who have like Newton, Darwin, and so on. Good ideas are rare, and good mutations are also rare. And if you have really good idea, you can establish a new species.
Well,
why any genetic evolution is needed?
Well, that's a long discussion, but I beg to have a different opinion there, because I think that these results that you have seen in recent literature they more reflect what people are looking for than what is out there in nature. Like if you don't look for genetic revolutions, chances are you won't find them. And speciation research is heavily biased towards looking for things that additive genetic. Like if I do a whole genome screen and I'm going to look for associations with, then I only find the things that are additive, right? There are very few people who can use whole genome screens to find things that are non-additive. Lots of the heritability that we observe is an emergent property of a complex system rather than that we actually, if I do a study of heritability in one population, I repeat it in the other, I get a different heritability. Even the QTL loci underlying my trait are different. Like there is a major problem of missing heritability. And like I think that very many of the ideas that emerge from like ecological speciation, it's very nice, but I don't believe that there is very much like that they are of broad importance. Like in Sticklebacks, I read a few of these papers. I worked in Sticklebacks for a while. I read a few of these papers. I can somehow believe that they got these results, yes. Whether it happened before or after speciation, I don't know. Whether these are the things that actually cause the speciation, I really don't know. I think I would need to see a lot more examples there before I would be convinced that that is really the major mode of speciation.
Even when we think about genetic control of some complex traits like Tartocarapax or something,
yeah.
These are mostly quite simple changes in ontogenetic rules, like this bone should
yeah.
always more rapidly or something like this. So, and the rest is just phenotypic accommodations.
Well, that could be, but like simple changes in ontogeny are already something different than like natural selecting on a trait. Yeah? I think like one illustrative example is perhaps how we lost our body hair. Like we are naked apes, right? If I ask my students how we lost body hair, then generally they come up with all kinds of adaptive explanations. The best explanation that I know of is just sexual selection for looking young in women, because like young individuals are hairless in most of the primate species. So this is a trait that perhaps we just kept. We didn't develop the trait de novo, we just kept it. So it would be a change in ontogeny really. Because like among human races, those races that have least body hair also have other characters like very round eyes, very round faces that are very reminiscent of like baby humans. So to me, like we can't test it, but it makes a lot of sense. But clearly you can see that there is a lot of debate in literature, which is merely in terms of like developing the trait de novo. So what you're saying actually that it might be a change in a regulatory process that gives you like retain something or change, that's already a very different story from the like traditional idea of natural selection changing the value of a trait.
Yeah,
like But still, like one thing, so I haven't said very much about possible ways to get these rapid changes, and that is something that I haven't thought so very much about. But one possibility I think is very real is in plants, because in plants, for example, the majority of speciation events seem to take place through hybridization. So there, like additive characters and things, they seem to play a smaller role if you have hybridization events. So hybridization, I could certainly imagine that causes a genetic revolution. So if you ask me what a genetic revolution is, I don't know, but I could imagine, for example, hybridizations contributing to that. If we hybridize Arabidopsis in the laboratory, which we did between populations at different genetic distances, the hybrids often have higher fitness in each of the parental environments. They are very healthy, they are highly outbred, and at the gene expression level they're dramatically different. So that would fulfill all the criteria for this kind of. In plants we know it's very common. In animals we are more on the fence. But I would point out that hybridization, to have a dramatic effect on the organization of an organism, does not need to happen between full-blown species. Like even in our own species, there has been this idea that you had an early human and a chimpanzee which split. And and after about 500,000 years got into secondary contact, after which you had mating between humans and chimps, after which they would have split again. Now, we have whole genome sequences for these species. Even then, it's very difficult to say whether that happened. But we do know that if we take a substantially diverged population and we hybridize it with another population, we can get something that is dramatically different. Yeah? So I think that hybridizing like populations rather than full-blown species is some way to perhaps get genetic revolutions. You're saying that no.
Genetically different, but is it really about the evolutionary novelty? It would be kind of like by the chaperones and also, and then morphologically static, and you know, that's but I don't want to take.
No, but like I think that at least at the genetic level, they're rather dramatically different. And I think that it would be very, very hard to detect it with hindsight. Like if you have two full-blown species and you merge them, yes, then if you have both species left and you have the hybrid, then you see this is a hybrid of these two species. That's easy. But if you have two populations of the same species that are very diverged, you merge them and you get something really different, but these populations somehow disappear, I think it would be much harder to say that, oh, this is a hybrid. So I think that we should really be thinking a little bit outside of the box here. There probably are ways to get these revolutions. Yes?
There has been a recent shift. I'm working with cloud. There has been a recent shift from the hard debate about polyploidization in clouds, like autopolyploids and autopolyploids, meaning became polyploids from the same set of chromosomes and from different species. And this debate, well, lasted for a long time and was stopped, let's say, or decreasing, let's say, a few years ago, just because people realized that it's completely nonsense, because all of the things that happens is in plants. That's a radical situation between being completely autopolyploid and being completely autopolyploid. But distant populations are a bit far away and quite closely. There are some post-zygotic or pre-zygotic barriers which may be on the same level as the different species, or maybe less, or maybe higher. And really, the concept of the species as something that really are perfectly mating together and with nothing else, especially in plants, is something, well, unbearable.
But how would you think? Like, do you think that these kind of interact could that? Do you think that could trigger something like a genetic revolution, or do you think that would just pass without?
Most of the recent ones, and when I say recent, I mean recent, something whatever started in 20th or 18th century, really recent plant pieces, are just because of some polyploidization, complete wiping out of the complete restructurization of the genomes, etc. Or became asexual, therefore aponetic, and then species as well, more or less better defined, but broadly defined, or not appropriately. But let's say, look at the most diverse, or the species, the groups that have the shortest evolution with the most prevalent species now. Those are really instable, like orchids, some kinds of Asteraceae, etc., which really don't have close barriers between the species and able to hybridize, make polyploids or depolyploid quite easily and quite frequently. So I think that total change of the genome is something that
can happen rather frequently. Well, you must have some ideas as to what happens there. Like I have mainly concentrated on figuring out like whether there is this punctuational component, trying to measure it, but much less on actually what is causing it. That do you think that you need a strong bottleneck to
Yes, I believe it's necessary. Strong bottleneck, but strong bottleneck is not enough to get genetic revolution. Actually, it's very important to specify what Mayr meant, what is supposed to be genetic revolution. He supposed it's dramatic change of frequencies of different alleles in population. He supposed that this stability of species is caused by stability of frequencies of different alleles. He supposed that they are closed, different alleles are closed each together in one complex dynamic network. So it's very difficult to increase frequency of some alleles in this polymorphic population. One separate allele to increase because it changes frequency of different alleles, and there are some forces
to keep it in balance.
Yeah, there are some negative feedbacks that keep it stable. And the genetic revolution in his terms is caused, for example, by this bottleneck or by some sampling effect. When we dramatically, artificially change these stable frequencies, this stability could disappear, and the population can shift into another equilibrium. So it's genetic revolution, not some intrinsic changes. It's different.
Well, like so Meyer was but he had this idea of genetic, but at the same time he criticized people like Russ Landy, for example, for being atomist. So they regarded the organism as a loose collection of traits. He certainly did emphasize the holistic view of an organism, where the fitness, he said, of every gene is only defined in the context of the other genes in the organism. I think even that basic notion seems to have disappeared from people doing genetics on a population scale nowadays. It just perhaps because it is so difficult. If we would have methods to do it, people would do it because they could publish more papers. But you can tell them 1,000 times that it is silly, but they will still do it because it's the only way they can publish papers. As soon as we give them an alternative, and now you need to do this, they will immediately do it because they can publish all their old data once again. But that seems to be what is driving science nowadays. Get your papers out. But like when it comes to these genetic revolutions, I haven't had much time to really think about this. There's several suggestions out. I think that these modern techniques, these high throughput molecular techniques, they would actually allow us to look at these things, to get some feeling for that, where earlier it was really painstaking to collect that data. But unfortunately, if there's not very many people thinking about it, then it's not going to happen, right?
I think the problem is that people don't like to read books. even to read short papers, it's rather difficult for them.
No, actually, I get it.
They have no time. They have to write grant proposals and grants.
Who is still reading literature, because you're actually supposed to write your own papers, right? So I was at the AAAS meeting in Boston last February, and there then the people from the publishing houses are around, and they can tell you really clearly what kind of books they want. Between 100 and 150 pages, because longer and people won't read it. Paperback, because people don't want to make an investment in a book, with color pictures as an online supplementary appendix. That is how you sell a book nowadays. But like Steve Habel, a few years ago, he was around in UMIA. He had this theory, this neutral theory of biogeography, biodiversity, and he tried to publish it in Nature, didn't want it, Science didn't want it. He went down the whole ladder of journals, and in the end he published it in the journal Coral Reef Research, because he spoke at a coral reef meeting, and they promised to publish the stuff irrespective of what it was, and they regretted it first because they also didn't like his story, but later on it became their most cited paper. So he decided to write a book instead. And Mike Arnold, so when we talk about speciation in plants and hybridization, Mike wrote a book about hybridization, and he tried to sell it to different journals, and they didn't want it. So he wrote a book. Yeah? So if you nowadays want to come up with something that is dramatically different in science, you write a book, because the journals are not going to take it. If you're planning on a career, you can take that one as an advice.
Yeah, maybe I was quite disappointed by your 20% change, because I think that you replace gradualis for quantum theory, which is also unpleasant for me. I think the first question is, do you think that 20% is a lot for opinion? Have you been surprised that it's only 20% or 20% is too much?
I have no subjective feelings about the percentages that I estimate, really. I should say a few things about that, perhaps, if we go back to that slide, because so I told you that we model this gradual evolution as a Brownian motion. But once we found these results, and we figured that a substantial part of evolution is occurring in association with speciation events, at least, well, that's how our model works. But anyway, then we figured that, well, there seems to be a problem here, and perhaps it is not appropriate then to model the process as Brownian motion. Because if there are all these interactions between traits, then we should expect the species to be, as Jaroslav said, elastic rather than changing over time. But Brownian motion still allows you for a lot of change over time. So what we did instead is that we modeled this as an Arnstein-Uhlenbeck process, where we have an attractor, and the attractor we changed when there is a new species, but then the species exerts a fluctuation around the attractor. Now that model actually outcompetes the Brownian motion model. If we do base factors for that, then the Arnstein-Uhlenbeck actually outcompetes the Brownian. You must be happy to hear that. Then the question actually, that would suggest that all evolution occurs during these kind of rapid changes, and the rest is just fluctuation around it. Now the question is, does that surprise me? Well, I think that the result will depend on the character. If we talk about color, I would expect that 100% of change occurs over time, and speciation doesn't matter very much. It could still be that there is some change during species, so fine, but it's not substantial. When we talk about body temperature in a homeotherm, I would expect that if there's any change, it will be very rare, but it will presumably lead to something that is really different. I can hardly imagine that occurring gradually. So there, no, it doesn't expect me. So then the question would become, am I expected to see a 20% change in body size? Well, it would be nicer to see how much of the variation, overall variation, is due to these speciation events. Now the 20%, it corresponds to approximately 60 to perhaps 80% of variation being due to the speciation events. Actually, so with the Arnstein-Uhlenbeck model, it would correspond to 100%. Yeah? But that model is harder to evaluate. So if I go to the other slide, here, these things, these intercepts, that corresponds to approximately 60 to 70% being due to speciation. If we do the same analysis for the number of gene copies, this is RNA-seq data, so we get estimates of gene copy number. If we do the same for estimates of gene copy number, the analysis is more complex, but we end up with approximately 60%, which worries me a little bit. I tested the method, of course, with simulated data and think it seemed to work, but that worries me slightly. It would seem that differences in gene copy number would to 60% be due to speciation events. To me, that sounds like a little bit of a high percentage. But for these data, I'm pretty sure Whether I find it a lot? Well, if I think about the complex systems, it would be 100% approximately, except for a few. I know, no, I don't have much of an opinion about it.
So my concern is that should forecast the results as cumulative function, and nearly all cumulative functions.
You mean, oh, the distribution of body sizes? These ones? Oh, these are not cumulative body size distributions.
No, it's body size distribution, but it's shown as cumulative function. And I think that they should look the same because it's like null hypothesis because 20% change in body size is something like intraspecific variation.
Oh no.
Between sexes.
If you have a population, I can tell you the variation in body size is 13% of the mean. And that is something that is very strange. It does not seem to depend on whether the species is abundant or anything. The variation around the mean is incredibly constant, which is something that evolutionary biologists also don't really have an explanation for. I could give you one, but that would be another talk. But the variation is about 13% of the mean. Now, if I take randomly take individuals from that population, let's say 10 individuals to start a new species, then the sampling variance is this like standard the standard deviation divided by the number of individuals. Yeah? So I will never get from 13 to 20. I will rather get from 13 to 1.3. Yeah? So the 20% is really not due to intraspecific variance. Mathematically, you can just exclude that possibility. That is really not the case.
Okay, but still, it's reached out here.
Yeah.
So I would like to scatter plot the true values, not cumulative function. That convince me that you observe something which is real, because here we can see only some average trend.
Yeah. Well, here, like I would say, we first did this. I'll go back to the here. So we first did this analysis on the species level data. This is like 6,500 species, and we end up with this estimate. So we have a prediction, and you see the red data comes from 317 pairs of subspecies. Fits don't get better than that. Yeah. To me, this is quite convincing. I don't think that this is some or another accidental average giving an identical cumulative distribution. Independent data rarely give you a better fit. I actually think that the fit is partly like just a coincidence. We could have been a little bit off there. But really, it's not just the average. The entire shape of the cumulative distribution corresponds to this. I think, like personally, I find this about as convincing as it gets. I have no idea where the 20% otherwise would come from, because it is way larger than the intraspecific variance.
Yeah? So, you think that most of the evolutionary changes is connected with speciation, but you don't know because you would get the same gradually, even if it is not just if the population that is shifted and the some novel trait is more likely to establish a new species. So what is the connection between speciation and evolutionary change?
So what like your alternative explanation that you have several populations within a species, you mean, and the one that has the biggest change is the one that is most likely to survive and as such.
Yeah, because there can be competition, and only if it shifts in niche, you can find a good niche or something like this.
Yeah.
So,
but how then would we see the association between morphological difference and speciation emerge in this analysis? Because like you would not get a split on the tree if you have a particular population that is aberrant, somehow different. and that would be most likely to survive, you would not see a split on the tree. So the diversification would not seem to be associated with the speciation event. I don't know, perhaps I didn't point it out, but the simple background of this is that if evolution is associated with speciation, or no, if evolution would be purely gradual, then evolutionary difference between species requires time. We need to wait, because it cannot be suddenly there. Yeah? So if we see two species that shared a common ancestor just 500,000 years ago, they cannot possibly be very distinct, because there is insufficient time for that if there is a gradual process of evolution. However, if evolution is rapid, then even the species that shared a common ancestor just 500,000 years ago, they can already be about as differentiated as species that shared a common ancestor about 5 million years ago. Of course, then we have to take into account the possibility of accumulating speciation events that we do not observe, but essentially the thing is that if the two species of chimp would be very distinct from each other, that would give you pretty good reason to assume that something happened during the speciation event, because there has been very little time for changes to accumulate afterwards. Yeah? Now, the chimps happen to be an example where there is very little change. And if you look at that distribution, we assume a normal distribution for like the difference. Yeah? On average, the difference is 20%, but most of these species differ by 0%. That's normal distribution. The peak is at 0. So like the chimps, for example, they were close to that peak. But that kind of evidence is really simple. Like, you look at very, very recent pairs of species. If those are, relative to the rest, fairly substantially diverged, then you can assume with relative confidence that something went really rapidly during that speciation event. And that pattern is where these estimates come from. I do not really understand how that pattern would emerge in a system as you suggest, where one particular population would...
Think about evolutionary changing phenotypes, say that there are different strategies.
Yeah.
So clever idea makes a new good strategy, so both can survive, and then each can specialize in its niche. We end up with two species. However, is it necessary to have connected this evolutionary changing phenotype with speciation or not?
Well, I think that it does not have to be so. I think that you can get these rapid changes also at other points.
Because in Yarda's idea, in Yarda's theory, say hypothesis, it must be connected. It should be connected with speciation.
Well, I think it does not always have. Think of an extreme situation in which you have a speciation event, but one of the species immediately goes extinct. Well, we would hardly call that a speciation event, right? So I think this analysis shows that very often it is associated with speciation, but I would not claim that it always has to be. I hardly know what causes these things. Like, I can come up with theories, but we're just starting to understand this, right? So I would not claim that it always has to be. It seems to be typically the case, because otherwise we would not see these kind of patterns. Like, otherwise we would not see that closely related species often are substantially diverged compared to those that shared a common ancestor long ago. But I'm not saying that it could never be the case. I can imagine that it would happen sometime.
In that simulation model of the speciation, because maybe the range of that shift and the range of the variability or the Brownian motion or whatever it is inside the plane, maybe the ratio of these two may predetermine the results quite easily.
No, I don't exactly understand. Could you rephrase that?
Well, as I look at it, there are shifts for mediating differentiation.
Yeah, these vertical lines. Yes.
So how long are they?
So they are drawn from a normal distribution with a particular variance. and that variance is the rate of evolution. So they come, like most of the time, there is no change. Yeah? Because for any variance, the mode is always at 0. But like if you have a large variance, then sometimes they can be really large. If you have a narrow variance, then they're on average smaller. Yeah? So these are drawn from just like in a Brownian motion, you draw the displacement always from a normal distribution with a certain variance. Well, we do the same here, only the variance is much larger than over time. Yeah?
Basically, nested to normal distribution.
Yes. But that's just because it's convenient to like there are two reasons to do that. First, the normal distribution is the maximum entropy distribution. So if we don't know anything else, that's our best guess.
Yeah? One thing is that nesting those two things will lead to another surprise null-shaped curve, meaning normal distribution.
Yes, it leads to a normal distribution, yes.
So what you're showing is that cumulative curve for me is...
That is the fraction of subspecies that have a body size ratio that is exceeding the value on the horizontal axis.
Still, isn't it just a cumulative function of normal distribution?
Yeah, it's just a cumulative function of normal distribution, yes. But that is, like we assume a normal distribution for these changes, right? So that's why the black line, that is the cumulative normal distribution given like for this rate of evolution that we estimate. Yeah, so we're not only saying that the average is 20%, but we're also saying it needs to the distribution should have the shape of a normal. Yeah?
One thing is, let's say that there are more processes like UFOs or God is creating some species with a normal distribution because it's neutral, why should create something else?
Yeah.
Then you wouldn't be able to distinguish just because nesting many normal distribution would lead again to normal distribution.
Yeah, but how do you mean what would we not be able to distinguish there? Oh, yeah. Well, you know, so the reason why we started with Brownian motion and then used the normal distribution is exactly that normal distributions are so easy to work with from a mathematical statistical point of view.
If you nest many distribution, you will get a normal distribution.
Yeah, well, of course, like that's the theory behind the Brownian motion, right? It's just applying the central limit theorem. So it was kind of easy to use also normal here, but there's also this like more fundamental criterion that if we do not know what is happening, then our best guess should be the maximum entropy distribution, which is normal.
Yeah, so, the problem is that it's so uninformative.
Yes.
You just from the normal distribution, you can't say from how many processes it started.
No.
Therefore, you just can't say, oh, I have just two levels. One is intraplane variation, and one is speciation. I can easily say there are some UFOs which are the thing that create that.
Sure.
That was the same point.
I thought that was the point that Lukács said. Then he wanted you to show not the cumulative or normal distribution, which is always there.
Yeah, well, the thing is the data does resemble the normal distribution. We cannot infer from simple shape of the data what process is governing it. Yeah. That is something that is fundamentally impossible.
That was the only point.
Okay, no, but sure. Sorry if I misunderstood that question, but just observing it's normal doesn't tell us what's causing it. Yeah. Of course not.
The species and the subspecies are normal distributed.
The point is that Jarda's thesis is stronger because he's basically saying that the big changes are the prerequisite of the big changes is speciation. But what we are, or you are just saying, is that it's not, of course, it's not anymore gradual. You must have just this quantum changes, but they are not necessarily associated with speciation. Or they are associated because these changes happen, you will have speciation. But
yeah, like that's another thing. We can't, of course, distinguish cause and consequence here. We don't know whether a species forms because there is a change, or whether the change emerges because a species forms. Yeah. That's something.
That's why I'm saying his thesis is stronger because he.
Like I'm not assuming, as I also said, like I have no idea what this is causing, but I know of a few suggestions of course, but that's not really my expertise of like saying exactly what would be generating that change. And not knowing that, the best guess is normal. And then we figured like we can predict the magnitude from the from the like interspecific data, which I think is really quite okay. So this also suggests that we might learn more about the process if we actually just look at the difference between the subspecies.
Well, I feel we are quite thirsty. So thank you very much again. And on the discussion,